Good afternoon, you guys. All right, so as I'm getting down your names, feel free, and this applies to the entire, Zoom meeting, but feel free to interject. Just actually just unmute and speak, or type out something for me. Okay, if you guys have any questions or comments, we're going to go over test number 2 today. All right. Thank you for your patience as we did not meet once or twice lately. We got ahead of schedule, and so anyway, let's see here. Make sure.
It's actually not a bad thing being ahead of schedule.
That's right. I'd rather be ahead of it than behind, right?
Right.
And I knew that we were in limbo. I knew that if we did one a week, um, thank you, Jeff. I knew that if we did one a week, that would not be sufficient. That we would you'd be behind. We'd be doing subjects long after or after, just after they're actually due. And so, absolutely, it's I'd rather err on the other side. Okay, so good. Thank you, Chetney, and it's great to have you. Even if there are only 5, I appreciate the 5 of you. You'll get your points for this. I want to share the screen, okay, and just go over certain terms. All right. So that which you need to be familiar with in preparation for test number 2. Okay, I do my best. It's there's subjectivity involved for sure. Trying to decide what an instructor trying to decide what he or she thinks is most vital, relevant for history majors, right? For future studies, as far as deriving some type of a relevant point for today, and so forth, right? So that's why, especially with latitude outside of the public school system of K through 12, you might have instructors who have, a variation in their tests that they write. But nevertheless, I'd like to think that some of this stuff would definitely almost be considered universal as far as that which instructors deem to be kind of paramount. So at any rate, jumping right in, okay? Remember, different historians are going to come with their own assumptions on the War for Independence. Some call it just that. Some, like Gordon S. Wood, believe that it was a bona fide revolution, right? But no matter what, if you're looking at material factors, you're looking at class differences and class conflict, you're looking at ideology as far as beliefs, right, and culture. It's going to dictate what facts you look at, right? Nevertheless, there tends to be some consensus about the following things being considered relevant, no matter what direction the historian is going to go in, right? As far as interpreting as to why the War for Independence happened. So one, which I think ought to be addressed no matter what the interpretation is ambiguity regarding subjectship, basically citizenship, right? English rights. Remember that the English Constitution is not one single written document. It's an amalgamation of decisions made. It's organic, like a living, growing plant or organism. So you have different precedents established with judicial decisions. You have, of course, legislative, laws that are enacted by Parliament. You have executive decrees by kings and queens, and the list goes on and on. Not only that, they had to decide kind of almost in ad hoc fashion as they were going along. Okay, what about Englishmen born in our colonies? What about, and remember the two broad categories were by bloodline. Is it just the father? Is it just the mother? Is it both? And then what happens when, like in Scotland, 1707 was incorporated into Great Britain. What about those born before 1707, right, in Scotland? So they had to go on case by case basis, basically. Then, in addition to that, you had at least 3 different types of colonial charters. You had royal charters, you have proprietor charters given to one single person, right, like William Penn or Lord Baltimore. You also had joint stock companies that were granted a limited times autonomy in their over their colony. Needless to say, you had different kings and queens, different parliaments, that granted these different charters, right? And they're going to differ in their language and the latitude that they give the colony, et cetera, et cetera. So, for instance, Massachusetts Bay Colony contended that there were elements to its charter that gave it somewhat of a blank check. I can't remember which particular one, but at least one colony in the South, it was made clear in the written charter that the people in that colony will have and exercise the rights of Englishmen, right? And so that's why, Benjamin Franklin went to England and had debate, engaged in debate with Parliament, because there was ambiguity regarding what our rights constituted, right, as an English colony. So I think you need to bear that in mind no matter what. I think you also have to look at strains in North America after the 1763, the end of the French and Indian War, right? So you had population boom in the early 1700s. You had dispersal. Uh, you had both phenomenons. You had large numbers of people moving into the cities, and the cities growing rather quickly. And then you also had a lot of people leaving the cities and going to the periphery, the western frontier of many of the colonies, right? So my point being with population, right, is at the end of the French and Indian War, the British had, quote, secured conquest rights to North America, at least to United States and Canada. And so now there was a need, right? There was a sense of necessity or even urgency to deal with these population changes. Okay, we need to make sure, right, that the problems and the issues that arise from a growing and moving population are addressed. So, for instance, in the cities, Howard Zinn states that poverty and crime became bigger issues. On the periphery, a lot of people, it was a common theme in American colonial history, in which colonists would move to the West, and it wasn't recognized yet, right, as legal jurisdiction, as far as having a representative from their new Western district. So they would complain and say, we want representation. We want to be able to elect one of our own in this new Western territory to be represented in the legislature over on the East Coast of the eastern side of their state. So those are just a couple examples. Also, Native Americans. Native Americans had split, fighting with the French or the British at the end of the war. But even those that fought with the French, right, the Huron and other tribes, uh, the British, they weren't particularly, arguably they in some ways, whatever degree that they felt, uh, not beholden to these native tribes that had chosen the French side instead of theirs at the end of this war, whatever extent that there might have been, a tradition of a bit of a vindictiveness toward tribes that had chosen the wrong side during a war, it seemed to have been superseded by a concern to the British that they did not want another French and Indian War for quite some time. So, hence, there was a desire, right, uh, almost amongst Whigs and Tories, to appease the Native American tribes because war is expensive. It's expensive in human resources and material resources, right? And they wanted to avoid it if possible. So, hence, the British wanted to keep American squatters and pioneers from crowding into Native American Western lands, right? And thereby, provoking atrocities and conflict that might drag the British Army right back into another war. Okay, so that oftentimes is considered relevant to why and how things went down beginning in 1764 with the Sugar Act, right? Where there's a series of you see it in the handout in the assignment. Hopefully, you remember the gist of it, whereby Parliament will begin taxing the colonies, right, directly and indirectly with their import and export trade, as well as internally, like the Stamp Act. And they're going to crack down on their system with customs officials. Remember, the customs officials were like the enforcers, like the highway patrolmen of the mercantilist restrictions, to make sure you had your proper papers, that you were taxed properly before you traded your goods, etc. And of course, you have the series of colonial semi to outright rebellious reactions to those laws and those policies, right? Where down to boycotting British goods, sending petitions to Parliament and to the King, um, uh, uh, civil disobedience, right? Different assemblies contending that they will not enforce this or that tax until they are properly represented in Parliament or until the assemblies have given their consent to those taxes. And of course, you hopefully remember how things just continue to escalate from there. So at any rate, people look at population changes, the Native American issue, right, as relevant to the War for Independence. Pardon me. I want to look at the test itself to make sure I'm not. All right. So, yeah. So I think we're okay on number one. Okay. There's so much more than that, you guys, but I just kept it simple for the test. Um,
I have a
uh,
question real quick though
yes.
about number one. So would it be a lot of like the British and Native American War? Is that mostly kind of like what's going to be on there as well?
No,
Okay.
no. Yeah. With number one, I'm trying to just stay relevant to the War for Independence, right? To
Okay.
Armed Rebellion.
Okay. Got it.
Yeah. No, that's a good question, but yeah, I didn't branch out there. Sorry.
Okay. Only because I mean, that was kind of talked about sometimes. So I didn't know if that was something I needed to like jog my memory back on as well.
Right. No, just remembering that simple fact that I have put up there is sufficient. Again, right, the latitude that instructors have in writing their test, I just chose not to go that direction. All right,
Okay. Thank you.
no problem. Okay, so salutary neglect, as you may recall, right? This arguably for quite some time has been the common interpretation in English schools, right? And remember that the British um, neglected enforcement of mercantilist restrictions, right? And permitted the North American political bodies, namely the assemblies, to acquire powers not formally intended by Great Britain. So remember, it's a very simplistic analogy, but excuse me, it's a simplistic analogy, but the that a parent, right, on paper, he or she, as mom or dad, has rather strict rules, right? But he or she's always gone, attending to matters that are considered more, you know, triage fashion, right? I'm trying to think of the adjective, just more vital, right? Uh, so at any rate, the son or daughter begins to live self-sufficiently. He or she begins making decisions and practicing autonomy, right? Like independence, more than was ever intended by the mom or dad, because the mom or dad is largely absent. So it becomes virtually autonomous, and that son or daughter also becomes economically self-sufficient and taking care of him or herself. Then, right, the analogy goes, at the end of the French and Indian War in 1763, now when Britain decides to really gain a better, more organized grip over the 13 colonies, it's like the dad finally coming home and telling the 18, 19-year-old son or daughter, all right, son, daughter, it's time to enforce the rules. And the son or daughter says, sorry, dad, too little, too late. I'm doing fine without your help. And I have been doing such for quite some time. So thank you anyway. So that's the notion. That's the thesis that you find in the textbook, salutary neglect, right? You look at poor enforcement of the mercantilist laws. Oftentimes the customs officials were absent from their posts. They were paid poorly, and it was seen as a stepping stone to better jobs. And so, hence, they were tempted to take bribes, right? And so, the assemblies. I tried to give one example after another of different assemblies, especially in Massachusetts, uh, acquiring certain rights, like over the budget, over the governor's salary, of course, their permission with taxation and legislation, right? So at any rate, they began to do well for themselves. And then Britain tried to crack down. So according to this thesis, we didn't have a revolution, right? We didn't have a 180-degree turn socially, politically, and economically. But basically, we fought to keep a good thing going. We basically did as we pleased. And once you taste that freedom, once you taste that economic self-sufficiency, you don't want to let it go, right? So at any rate, any questions on that? That's the salutary neglect thesis. All right. Bernard Bailyn's book is Court History. Remember court history, right? Like a king or queen asks a scribe to write a history of his or her kingdom. And so, of course, it's going to choose. It's going to select facts and interpret those facts and present them in such a way as to justify, even praise those leaders. So court history is good patriotic history, oftentimes learned in elementary school, right? To foster patriotic sentiment, etc. So with court history, right, we contend the idea of American exceptionalism, that we're a special country, right? We wouldn't be special, right, if we simply were fighting to keep a good thing going, if the salutary neglect thesis were true, right, is true. Um, we wouldn't be special if we were just fighting for some Machiavellian motives on behalf of the leaders, like Howard Zinn states. But what makes us special, right, is that we are that our motives were ideological, right? Ideological determinism. That we were led by beliefs, right? And not just any beliefs, but lofty beliefs, right? So we talked about, right, the Enlightenment, the French Enlightenment, the Scottish Enlightenment. We talked about the radical liberals in Britain itself. Okay. We talked about what else? We talked about the Great Awakening. So those are some of the ideological sources, right? And we'll get back to those pretty quickly. But then also we talked about, right, the role of our intellect, of our intelligentsia, our educated middle class men, right, who made their living, developed their public role in relation to academia or things academic. So like Franklin, Dickinson, right, Jefferson, etc. So supposedly, right, they imbibed these ideas because they were men of leisure and had the education and the time to read all this stuff. And remember, not to also, so they imbibed these works, and remember also the English press, like Cato's letters. I should italicize that, but I'm not going to worry about it. So they imbibed these works. They read oppositional newspapers back in England, like Cato's letters, right? And they summarized the main ideas in palatable form. And palatable form meaning, the average person didn't have the time to read a 300-page work by Voltaire, right? So they would simply summarize it in a pamphlet of 13 pages, for instance. So they truncated the length, and they also summarized through more commonly grasped language, so that the common people had the time and the ability to read this stuff. via pamphlets, posters, newspaper articles, etc. Then there's evidence of grassroots usage of terms and ideas consistent with these intellectual movements. So things like social contract, natural rights, etc. All right. So hence to Bernard Bailyn, he finds this, and not only that, not only did Sons of Liberty chapters, committees of correspondence, etc. Not only did they utilize these terms and so forth, right? And these ideas were manifested at the colony level or state level, right? In the new governments. So remember, when colony after colony declared independence, they began changing their governments in such a way so as to practice these ideas. So because of those two things and other factors, right, Bernard Bailyn believes that not only were the founding fathers influenced by what they read, right, but that they successfully influenced the masses into understanding, believing in, and demanding these new ideas, right? And that evidence of the common people becoming, quote, enlightened can be found in factors like such that grassroots organizations used those familiar terms, right? And that the states began practicing those terms with their new constitutions during the War for Independence. So any questions on that? That's the romantic image of the War for Independence, that it truly was a revolution, right? An intellectual, ideological revolution. Howard Zinn, right? Very cynical, Marxist, right? Conflict history. Different classes as competing factions, pursuing their own interests, often to the detriment of the other classes. So to him, right, he shows how the poor and the working class became increasingly marginalized, not only by the British governors and institutions, but also by their own elected reps in the assemblies, who would be, right, the future founding fathers. Because remember, the argument is, right, is if you look even at a picture of the founding fathers, they're wearing their periwigs, they're dressed so nicely, they're holding their posture and just their whole persona, right, in a very dignified fashion. Most of them were lawyers. At least half of them were college educated or very successful entrepreneurs. They were not a microcosm of the society itself. If you wanted a mini example, right, a sample of the population at the Constitutional Convention, then you should have had many more common farmers, subsistence farmers growing their own food, and small scale cash crop farmers who were just beginning and scarcely successfully growing their own crops to sell at the market. So, at any rate, right, he contends that these founding fathers, right, feared class war or an attack from the poor, and they envied the British top leaders. So hence, they hijacked very shrewdly the Poor's Rebellion and made a scapegoat of the British. Told them, right, your problems are because of, on account of the British. Fight with and for us, and we'll kick them out, and we promise a much better society. And remember everything from the previous one, the French and Scottish Enlightenment, and these other sources, right? Howard Zinn sees that all as manipulative propaganda, right? As a carrot to try to induce the poor to fight with and for them, but that they had their own designs. Any questions? All right, so the Enlightenment. Okay, and in this one, I'm talking about the French Enlightenment. So with the French Enlightenment, right, you had ideas such as, remember, it emanates from like a deism, the idea that there are natural laws that have been created by the Creator, and that which is natural is that which is most healthy and ought to be attained, right? So in the state of nature, right, man is born free. Government is a necessary evil and a servant to protect man's natural rights. Okay, man is born free. Government is necessary evil. It's our servant, not our master. It's there to protect our natural rights. Right? And remember, that's connected oftentimes or summarized through the works of John Locke and Rousseau as the social contract. All right. So you see some of those natural rights in our Bill of Rights. You have intellectual autonomy, I think, of Voltaire. Have a mind of your own, be able to speak it, be able to protest peacefully, right? Have an interchange of ideas coming from multiple worldviews. You have the right to bear arms, the idea right from the Scottish Enlightenment, actually, but I'm going to go ahead and put it here, right? We're going to get to the Scottish Enlightenment in just a moment, all right? You have due process, like Beccaria, natural rights that you're entitled to if you're ever accused of having committed a crime. And you have the right of self-cultivation or pursuit of happiness. And I think of Diderot and Condorcet, who wrote the French encyclopedias, right? They wanted the common person to be able to educate him or herself, to train him or herself in some economic trade, to rise up as highly as his or her, right, merit will take him or her, and hard work. All right, so the Great Awakening. Just remember for the test, conditional deference. Remember, deference is knowing your place and accepting the authority of your superiors in society. And so the Great Awakening said, wait a minute, if your leaders, right, in this case, your Anglican bishops and priests, as a religious awakening, if they are not following God's laws, then you have the right, even the duty, to defy them. Okay, so conditional deference. Sticking to the bears here, okay, or else I'm going to take too long. I want you to do well on the test, and I feel like I'm giving you enough to do that. All right. Scottish Enlightenment, remember, is libertarian. It's a distrust of human nature with arbitrary power. Remember, arbitrary power, no rhyme or reason, no consistency. You could do as you please, right? The Scottish Enlightenment thought you should err on the side of democracy. Because remember the demos, the commoners in Greek, right? It was commonly held at that time period by even the most liberal ideologies that the people will oftentimes get things wrong, right? But nevertheless, that it's a lesser evil, right? That they're less likely to engage in kind of Machiavellian manipulative schemes that can take away the freedoms of the people. Keep government deliberately weak, small as far as its resources, localized, transparent, and accountable, right? Any questions so far? All right, Joseph Ellis on Washington is, remember, he focuses on the role of self-interest being thwarted by the British, and that hence it may have been a possible motive in his leading the rebellion for independence. So it's what I called it subjectively, from my take at least on that book, is that I call it mildly revisionist, because you definitely see a selfish side of George Washington, a proud, vain side, for sure.
Excuse me, Mr. Cal, can you scroll down a little bit? I can't see. I don't know if anybody else can
Sure.
for what you're typing. Thank you.
No
Okay.
problem. And I say mild, right? Because Washington believed, according to this book, that the patronage system and mercantilism were unfair and foolish. Remember, the mercantilist system, you had to have certain connections, right, and papers to engage in trade, business transactions, business development, land purchases, right, without the proper papers and connections. And I hope I'm not getting this wrong, but to me, what I've inferred from my readings is the patronage side is kind of the political side of the coin, so that you get a political position, right? You get a job because of your connections to the crown. So to him, right, he was for meritocracy. The position should go to those who merit, who earn, who deserve, right? By talent and hard work, the position, rather than by political privilege. So hence, in our Constitution, right, we expressly forbade the establishment of a nobility or aristocracy. Remember, this is number one on the Articles of Confederation assignment, is what's the common narrative, right? Is that the states and their leaders and constituents behaved selfishly and short-sightedly. I guess that's not a word. I'm going to use it nevertheless, okay? I probably will be your worst spelling instructor you'll ever have. All right, let's see here. So states and their leaders and constituents behaved selfishly and short-sightedly, playing into the hands of the conservatives who could proverbially tell the liberals, I told you so, regarding confederacies and democracy. And remember, right, with their education, so I give examples, right, the common examples of states fighting with one another, and hence showing the the proverbial costs or disadvantages of having a confederacy. Remember, confederacy, each state is almost autonomous. It's almost like a league of separate countries. And you could easily guess, right? When you look at confederations like in Renaissance Italy and Scandinavia, oftentimes they ended up fighting with one another, and it caused so much disunity that it was harmful. And that arguably happened to a degree during our confederation. Then democracy, remember Aristotle, Plato, others had written, right, that the common person doesn't have the self-control, doesn't have the virtue, doesn't have the education or intelligence to be trusted with governmental responsibility. And hence, if you give power to the demos, to the people, they're going to abuse it. They're going to be easily led by pathos, right, by emotion. They're going to blindly envy the wealthy, and engage in things like land redistribution or wealth redistribution or taxation policies that harm the rich and eventually perhaps cause class warfare. Look at like the Gracchus brothers of Rome with the tribunes, the elected reps of Rome. And so hence, right, you see Shays' Rebellion and other pieces of evidence of the people acting very rashly, very selfishly, very economically irresponsibly. And so the conservatives could tell the liberals, right, I told you so. You've read this stuff as well as we have. So it played right into the conservative hands in meeting first in Maryland, then in Philadelphia, to devise a less democratic, more centralized government. And to me, this subject's a little bit boring because I love debate, and it's just it hasn't been challenged very successfully. It's been the standard narrative for a while.
So for that one, do we kind of need to know like the main points of the Articles of Confederation?
No, basically just exactly, I mean, really, Chetney, just what I have written, what I've
Okay.
typed. Yeah, I you won't need to know exact details. To me, right, most of the time I want you to go away from this class with the bigger picture, right? So I try not to make you, immerse yourself on test at least in the minutiae.
Okay, thank you. Oh, and then real quick, the Joseph Ellis on Washington, was that like a side kind of book or something that we needed to like research and read on?
Yeah, no, not at all.
Okay.
Just be familiar with his thesis. He's just like oftentimes, right, when I put these argumentative assignments together, it's been either like a what I think consider to be an interesting lecture that I've sat under at one time, or an interesting book with an interesting thought-provoking thesis that I've read and come across. So that's the
Okay.
case here. I myself was able to get my hands on this book, read it, and then I tried to summarize as best I could what
Okay.
I thought Joseph Ellis's thesis and depiction of Washington were.
Okay. Thank you.
Right? No problem. And please remember, as I say often, I'm not trying to get you to uncritically accept these arguments. By all means, disagree with them. I just feel like they're interesting, they're thought provoking, and also they're relevant for the few people who become history majors, and that I think they're going to come across those arguments or theses again. Okay. All right. So Pauline Myers' thesis is, remember, is that the founding fathers were conservative, and that public clamor for more liberal and enlightened, components to the Constitution was needed to get the founding fathers to concede such. So hence, right, if it were not for popular protest during the ratification process of approving the Constitution, that we may not have our Bill of Rights. Certain other components found in the Constitution that we're so proud of today, right? So the founding fathers, they wrote the Constitution. Some of them wanted to, in one, manifestation or another, wanted to basically correct their own paper. They wanted to be the ones that approved of this Constitution that they themselves had written. And in states, you had, like in Massachusetts, right? You had unelected reps, right? Unofficial reps who were elected by the people in their small village, came uninvited to the ratification conventions and said, guess what, guys? My little town of Braintree, Massachusetts, states that we're not okay with this Constitution until you print it and we can read it, or until you put something in protecting the rights of citizens if they're suspected of having committed a crime, et cetera, et cetera. So because of these complaints, because of the friction that was caused from uproar from below, the founding fathers conceded, right? And began giving these liberal and enlightened concessions to the people in order to have 9 of the 13 states approve it. So it makes the people look wonderful, right? Vigilant over their rights, insistent upon certain enlightened beliefs being, materialized into law. But the founding fathers, it does not make them look, too progressive. It was as if they needed pressure to put this, and if it were up to them, they wouldn't have done so. That's subjective, okay, but I thought it was very thought-provoking and interesting. So that's her thesis. You guys okay with that? On board? As far as I'm not in agreement intellectually, but as far as knowledge, command of this for the test. State governments, remember that they were relative to the time, relative to other governments. They were relatively liberal and enlightened. And remember, I'm talking about classical liberalism, where the individual ought to be as autonomous as possible, and big brother government ought to stay small and unobtrusive into our lives. So hence they also were libertarian. Government don't tread on me. Government only as a necessary evil. Keep it small, accountable, transparent. All right. So in 1787, what type of government did we devise? We devised a constitutional, right? So hence, theoretically, my command over this is not very strong, and I apologize. Technically, we highlight popular sovereignty. The Constitution is our ultimate authority, but it's our ultimate authority only because of popular consent through the ratification process, right? So technically, we're the bosses. We're the ultimate source of authority. But because we gave our permission for the establishment of the Constitution, now the Constitution is supreme, right? So hence you can't violate it. You're not supposed to, right? And so hence it's an enlightened and liberal idea. So constitutional, federal. Remember, federal is a balance between a confederacy where the states are virtually independent and a unitary government when the central government controls everything. We have a balance, right? So that's the federal part. And then we have a republic like Rome. It's a mixed government according to Aristotle, right? There are offices that are popularly elected. There are some that are appointed. The terms differ. There is a system of checks and balances and sharing and cooperation, hence a republic, not a democracy. The economic system, we have capitalism, but not laissez-faire. Not government, let this system, the economic system of private property, private transactions, right, be completely left alone. From the very beginning, you saw in the early Republic handout, Alexander Hamilton and the Treasury Department in particular, during the very first administration, became, relatively heavily involved in the economy. Remember, the Federalist Papers are a series of like 85 short essays, intellectual and historical defense, right, or apology of or for our new, at that time, right, less democratic, more centralized republic. So this is the manner by which the conservatives, right, like Hamilton and Madison, tried to influence public opinion. And in particular, they were trying to influence their liberal elite contemporaries, trying to alleviate their fear about having a stronger, more centralized, less democratic government than the Confederacy. All right, enlightened components. We have some elected offices, right? We have no nobility and a guarantee to all states of a republican form of government. We have a system of checks and balances. Etc. Conservative elements, and you guys have seen this. What about citizenship? There was no declared universal citizenship. It was up to each state, right, to determine citizenship. Slavery was implicitly endorsed. Only 1 out of 4 major federal offices were elected by citizens. Article 1, Section 8 gave a lot of power to the federal government. The necessary and proper clause, fugitive slave law, and contract clause, right? If you're under contract, if you owe money, you still are under that contract, you still owe money, etc., under this new government. So those are some examples to me of conservative elements to our Constitution. By all means, these lists aren't exhaustive, right, or complete, but I think I've given you enough to know for the test. And remember, to them, right? I, instructor subjectively, all right? I don't believe they were that far to the right. They wanted elected offices. They wanted checks and balances, right? They wanted elections. They wanted a written constitution circumscribing or limiting what governmental leaders can and cannot do. They wanted a capitalist system. They didn't want an established church and standing army in peacetime. Nevertheless, right? They were elitist about who ought to be elected. They thought by nature and by nurture, right? And by their circumstances and upbringing and education, etc., right? Some more qualified than others. And that they ought to serve as the quote filters of what their constituents want. So to me, that, you know, that they're limited in how elitist they were relative to, you know, those on the right, arguably like in Latin America, which I think, you know, they were much further to the right. So remember I said in the Zoom meeting, do you believe in the equality of all people? Right? That's a rhetorical question, the answer to which should be yes, as far as what we're entitled to, what our opportunities, rights, privileges, right, responsibilities should entail. Equality, right? But do you believe everyone is equally capable of writing an English paper for you, of fixing your car? That people by nature and nurture, some are more gifted and qualified in areas than others. Remember, the Anti-Federalists were libertarian, government don't tread on me, and they were initially opposed to the Constitution because they thought it was too centralized and insufficiently democratic, etc. Those are just some of their grievances. So I want you to know the basics of Hamilton's system, right? Taking states' debts, right? Subsidizing industries, ostensibly to become self-sufficient as a country, so we could develop and manufacture all our own goods that we need and want, and not be economically dependent upon another country or the goods therefrom. So taking states' debts, subsidizing industries, gaining revenue via some cabinet taxes that technically these cabinet members are handpicked. So that violates the notion of taxation by representation. Import tariffs, right? Putting taxes on goods that are imported into the country and making us have to pay more as consumers for them. And by issuing bonds. And remember, it was the rich who had the money, the means, right, of purchasing these bond certificates. And of course, they didn't do it out of the goodness of their heart, right? They were promised lucrative, relatively high interest rates in return. So it looked, right, who were developing the key industries? Wealthy, pre-corporate guys. Who's lending money to the government and getting richly reimbursed? Wealthy guys, right? So a lot of this smacked of a plutocracy, of a rule by the wealthy in cahoots with the government. And then remember, he developed a national bank, and where in the Constitution and either of the first two articles Can you find that? That's a rhetorical question. You can't, right? And what did he do? He issued the necessary and proper clause, and it worked with the Supreme Court. And that clause had already frightened the libertarian liberals because it seemed like it could serve as a blank check to get Congress, the cabinet, the government, right, to do what it wants and then justify it with this vague necessary and proper clause. And I remember also his response to the Whiskey Rebellion, raising a 13,000 man army to fight against these whiskey rebels. So for these and other reasons, right, he alienated and frightened liberals supposedly into forming an oppositional party, and hence the two-party system. Any questions? All right, Washington's Balancing Act. To conservatives, he wanted to exude strength, an aura of majesty, right? Namely for longevity of this republic. There's a lot of discourse on that, right? Because our confederation didn't last very long. So there was a fear amongst conservatives that neither could this new government, this new republic. So he supposedly was doing it for longevity and as kind of, I hate to compare it to fascism, but kind of as a symbol of unity of all the different factions that were going at each other's throats, right? That they could unite under one leader for whom they had the utmost respect and deference. So he issued executive privilege, right? So that he didn't have to be accountable with the information he knew to the press and to Congress. He was willing to crush the Whiskey Rebellion. He unilaterally declared neutrality in the Napoleonic Wars or the Continental Wars. Napoleon hadn't arisen quite yet, but they would morph into the Napoleonic Wars. And remember, he gave Hamilton, right, a long leash with the Treasury Department to do as he deemed necessary, supposedly for the betterment, the economic betterment of the country. To liberals, he first relinquished his sword. Civilian rule, right, over the military. That was key to the Scottish Enlightenment. He had press conferences. He tolerated public scrutiny and opposition. Remember the Citizen Genet affair, the Aurora and Gazette newspapers tore into him. Remember, Citizen Genet even flirted with treasonous material, right? Contending that as a representative of the French Revolution, that Washington here had betrayed the spirit of 1776, right? With all those enlightened principles found in the Declaration of Independence, and that the people ought to do something about it, and that they ought to support the French Revolution and the French Army and Navy, even if their chief executive had declared neutrality. And remember also, he was pretty, fair subjectively with his cabinet choices of putting both liberals and conservatives in there. So then now we're looking at number 2 of the early Republic handout. And remember, McCulloch, to me, this is court history. Remember, he contended, and you guys did well on this with your assignment. Adams was too honest for his own good. Alienating both parties because of his independence of mind. And because I don't have to, as far as the test, I'm going to refrain from getting into the details of that because you've already gone over it on the assignment, and that's all you need to know for the test. So remember, these were constitutionally dubious. Immigration powers from Congress given to the president, right? And curtailment of our First Amendment rights characterizes the Sedition Act. However, he did not vigorously enforce either, I think, subjectively. And so does McCulloch. And remember, he's a one-term president. Remember, Hofstadter issues, I think, a fascinating mom and dad thesis, right? So he's dealing with wealth guilt. He's dealing with resentment of noble family members. He's dealing with an earnest desire for his common father's approval. And so hence, that upbringing influenced his subsequent public image as a democratic man of the people. All right. Jefferson's contradictions, you find these, you guys can get the answers right from the handout. All right. For one, he was partisan with his choice of cabinet members, etc. And he was for intellectual debate, right? And the free market of ideas. But he arguably surrounded himself with yes men. Remember, he was a strict constructionist, right? As a libertarian who feared and hated big government, right? Leaders could do only that which was explicitly stated in the Constitution. and no more, right? So he seemingly violates this conviction on several occasions, right? The Tripolitan or Barbary Coast Wars. Remember, he sent William Eaton on a mission to try to engage in a coup to overthrow, right, Yusuf Karamanli and put his brother Ahmed on the throne instead, because Yusuf was extorting American merchants, and eventually even, right, Washington or Jefferson sent the USS Philadelphia Navy to punish the Basha of Tripoli for endorsing this system of extortion. And then if you didn't cooperate, they would capture you and sell you as a slave in the market at Tripoli or in Constantinople. But he doesn't get congressional approval to do these things, at least not at first. And he acts without congressional permission. And that is not explicitly stated that he could do. If anything, it's stated that he cannot do that or should not do that in the Constitution. He unilaterally buys Louisiana Territory from Napoleon, right? Then he sends what some people believe were not just intellectual and practical, but also military espionage or spying parties, most famously Lewis and Clark, to see what he needs to do, right, to take advantage of and subjugate Native Americans, for one thing. He puts a 21-man commission in the northern sector and one in the southern sector over the Louisiana Territory, and does not allow the native Creoles, Cajuns, and others to practice democratic self-government. He wrote scathingly in Notes on the State of Virginia and in the original draft of the Declaration of Independence against slavery. But oftentimes he had about 160 slaves. He wrote as an example of the unhealthy nature of relations between slaves and masters. He said an example of which is the romantic union of a slave owner and a female slave. Because after all, right, she has to become a sycophant. She has to be someone who cannot be honest with him, has to be a yes person. And if she has any ambitions, she's going to have to keep them quiet and be a bit manipulative, right, and dishonest regarding those ambitions. And then, of course, he has his affair and lives with Sally Hemings and has 4 children that grow to adulthood, and then tries to hide it when it becomes publicized. He didn't even free his slaves when he died. And he also wrote, right, about the inherent inferiority of African Americans, of people from Africa, that they were biologically, by birth, less intelligent, less creative, less capable of creating culture, etc. And how ironic, right? One of his sons, with a biracial son with Sally Hemings, his name was Eston, was incredibly gifted, intellectual, musically talented, just like a living refutation of the Sambo image. But yet Jefferson continued to be scared to death of miscegenation, of interethnic sex at a large scale, because he thought that African blood would dilute WASP blood, right? White Anglo-Saxon Protestant blood. How ironic. Hamilton's bank, or Hamilton's system, he didn't kill it. Conservatives were certain that when he won in 1800, he would kill Hamilton's bank and system, but he didn't. He even helped finance the Cumberland Road. So when you look at all these contradictions, right? Remember, Alan Brinkley, our textbook contends, right, that forces seemingly beyond Jefferson's control made him feel compelled to switch from an idealist, right, who wanted to improve the world, to a pragmatist. Someone who doesn't think about being consistent with one's ideology or even ethics for that matter, but simply on kind of case by case basis makes a practical decision that he or she believes will yield the best, right, short or long term benefit. So sometimes, right, we use the word tied to pragmatism of a lesser evil. And you have to remember also, I guess, in fairness to Brinkley's thesis, is Jefferson was incredibly, by so many accounts, Hofstadter especially, very non confrontational. So hence, Brinkley could have gone a different route. He could have said that Jefferson became drunk with power, that he changed and became more conservative with age, that he cut a deal with the liberals when the House decided on him. That was primarily Federalist, the opposite party, when it came down to a tie between he and Aaron Burr. But he doesn't take those routes. So remember, mainly with the War of 1812, it's mainly the video, okay? Remember the two reasons we've gone over officially? Our violation of international rights as a neutral country on the high seas, including impressment of our boys, right? And fomenting rebellion amongst our Native Americans. So for those reasons, we fought against Great Britain. We fought against Canada of our own choosing by invading Canada with a three-pronged attack, and against Great Britain's Native American allies, chiefly, right, like the Shawnee and the Creek, under people like Tecumseh. Remember, the Warhawks wanted Native American lands in the West, so they may have had an ulterior motive. Even if they, people like Calhoun, Clay, right, Jackson, even if they themselves didn't covet the land, they knew that it would be a popular cause and in the future garnish themselves votes from white men, from white citizens, right? And taking these lands from the Native American red sticks, as they were called, right? The Native American tribes and the people within the tribes who decided to fight with Britain instead of us. Remember from the video, cases of heroes. So Jackson, all right, Andrew Jackson, Oliver Hazard Perry, Stephen Decatur. Remember the sense of unity and patriotism. Remember the sense that the Federalist Party died, yet the liberal, Democratic Republicans ironically embraced Hamilton's vision and system after the war, ostensibly to patriotically become self-sufficient. So generically, they called it the American system instead of Hamilton's system. We tried to declare cultural independence. And it's probably not, like I said, with Hamilton system, it's probably not a coincidence that in the 1820s, we're really going to do much across the country to develop infrastructure, subsidizing businesses, etc., and begin what will later become known as our, our industrial revolution. And remember, technically, we returned at the Treaty of Ghent in Belgium. We returned all properties prior to the war back to both parties. So no territory was acquired from us over the British or for the British over us. Now, Red Stick territory, right? Native American territory. That's another question. We, of course, acquired that at the end of the war. And that is tied to the Trail of Tears, etc. Later. So are there any questions?
Professor, the test that you gave us on Canvas is the actual one, right?
I believe so. Yeah, I intended to. It should be.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. Any other questions?
Are you going to post it today under quizzes because it's not up there?
Oh yeah, I got to put it in quizzes, don't I?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, I'm sorry.
Okay.
Yeah, because I'm so glad you mentioned that, Chetney, because I thought, okay, no, I posted test 2 for my late start class, but no, I haven't posted it under quizzes, perhaps.
Right. It was just the review.
Okay. Yeah,
That
no,
you.
I definitely need to and will do that. Okay.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you for reminding me. Make sure I have everyone's name. I have a couple that I didn't initially catch.
Well, thank you for going over all this. I have to go pick up my kids from school, but
No problem.
thank you.
You're very welcome. Thank you for your appreciation. And actually, we're done, you guys. I feel like we've gone over the whole test.
Yeah, thank you. I feel way more prepared.
Good.
Glad I was able to join today.
Good, Kayla, as am I. That makes me feel great. That encourages me. So
Thank you.
yeah, thank you for your feedback. And yeah, go get that test, okay?
All right.
All right. Have a good one, you guys. Thank you. Kirthana, will it be due Friday? I need to find the sheet here. Test 2 is due Sunday night, the 18th. That's what I have here on my sources. All right, no problem. So have a good night, okay? Bye-bye.